everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of Economist Intelligence Unit's Global Outlook video. My name is Agathe Demarais, and I'm the Global Forecasting Director at the Economist Intelligence Unit. I'm joined today by Andrew Viteritti, our lead for Commerce and Regulation and US analyst, and Dexter Thillien, our lead analyst for Telecoms and Technology, based in London. Today, we're going to discuss the potential implications of a Chinese attempt to annex Taiwan. And that's a fairly topical topic, given the recent declarations of Chinese President Xi Jinping that China would proceed with what China sees as reunification between the Chinese mainland and Taiwan. And we're going to take a look at this topic from two angles. The first one will be how will the US react? And the second angle will be what would be the impact of such a scenario on the global semiconductors industry, given Taiwan's lead in this field. I'm going to turn to you, Andrew, first to discuss how we think at EIU that the US would react in such a scenario. And spoiler, we think that the US would react to a Chinese attempt to annex Taiwan. So perhaps, Andrew, as a scene-setting question, why are we concerned at the EIU, and why do we think that China might attempt to seize Taiwan, say, in the next decade?
Well, there are several factors and reasons, and as you mentioned, the risks are indeed rising for this. The first and perhaps the most important and most relevant to what we've been seeing lately is that a recent warming of relations between the US and Taiwan has prompted China to make regular incursions near Taiwan's airspace. That has raised the chances of a military miscalculation, for example, an accidental collision between Taiwanese and Chinese fighter jets, which could spark a conflict in turn. Another more immediate factor is that China's leadership is currently fixated on the idea of so-called reunification with Taiwan, much as you had mentioned, Agathe. And then there are longer-term factors at play. A big one has to do with economic might. So at EIU, we're forecasting that the size of China's economy will surpass that of the US by the early 2030s. That shift in the balance of economic power could prompt China to reassess the risks and costs associated with an attack on Taiwan. A second longer-term factor has to do with technology. We believe that China's progress in the tech sphere means that by the 2030s, Chinese firms will no longer depend on Taiwan for semiconductors. Their dependence is currently quite high, and that could also wind up shifting the risk calculation for China. So certainly, Agathe, there's no shortage of factors driving up risks, especially when we look over the longer term.
No, the multi-million-dollar question. Do we think at EIU that the US is likely to intervene? We've said yes, so perhaps let's take a look at the factors that really underpin this forecast.
Well, we do think it is likely, as you have mentioned before. We think the US will intervene. We think that it will defend Taiwan if China were to invade the island. And there are a couple of factors driving this assumption on our side. The first is that inaction would likely be viewed by the US as a strategically unattractive option. Inaction would send worrying signals to the US's allies in Asia and could even exacerbate existing tensions elsewhere in the region, such as on the Korean Peninsula. Inaction also would be a challenge to the US's status as the world superpower and would be an admission that the US is losing its position to China in Asia and possibly on the global stage. Now, a final factor is that sanctions, which could be an alternative to a full-blown conflict, wouldn't be a credible or even feasible option for the US in our view, given the scale of China's manufacturing output and the importance of China to international trade. A blockade on that country would only raise the risks of goods shortages and perhaps even public discontent. So essentially, it's our view that China has become too big to sanction, and this will only increasingly be the case as time goes on.
And so actually, how does that work with China's calculus? And what I mean here is that we're really forecasting World War III, essentially, if China tries to seize Taiwan and the US is reacting. What are your views on this? Do you think actually this could be a deterrent effect for China, the conviction that the US would or could react?
Absolutely. So essentially, you had mentioned that the million-dollar question would be whether the US would intervene, whether it would react. And I guess maybe the $2 million question could be whether China would actually choose to invade Taiwan. It's our view that China's belief that the US would defend Taiwan would likely be sufficient to discourage China's leadership from staging that type of attack in the first place. A US-China war would have massive and potentially devastating consequences, not just for the US and China, but also for the global economy at large. And we believe that both countries would view it in their best interest to avoid that type of outcome. So essentially, Gat, we see this situation as likely to be similar to the one that prevailed during the Cold War, where mutual deterrence between two superpowers, in that case, the US and the Soviet Union, was a major factor in preventing war, even as tensions were very high.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That was a very concise summary. Very interesting topic, and I'm sure that we'll go back to this topic many times in the coming months and years. Dexter, I'm going to turn to you now to discuss what the impact of such a scenario would be on the global semiconductor industry. And perhaps your scene-setting question would be, why is Taiwan so important for semiconductors?
So Taiwan is important because of one company mostly. So TSMC, which I think a lot of people may have in the news. So the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is by far the market leader in terms of chip manufacturing, ahead of Samsung and ahead of Intel. It is also the one with the most cutting edge technology for chips. So it's going to be launching what is known as 3 nanometer technology within the next 12 months. It is also at the center of the relationship between the US and China. One, because they will buy a lot of things from US companies, a lot of machinery in order to manufacture those chips, but also US companies. Let's take an example, Apple. Apple will buy semiconductors from TSMC, then the semiconductors will be shipped to the mainland to be assembled in China to then be sold and shipped worldwide and globally to make Apple the most valuable company in the world. So very, very important in that relationship. And also, just to finish off on that point, we've seen over the last year or so with the chip shortage, especially in the auto sector, that semiconductors is not just for the telecoms and technology sectors, but for every sectors. And because Taiwan is a leader, or TSMC is a leader, that makes it even more crucial in the global economy.
Well, it's really interesting that you mentioned the global chip shortage that is taking place at the moment, because it's been all over the news. And perhaps let's zoom in on this question for a few minutes. How have different countries reacted to this situation?
So what we're seeing overall is that technology has become geopolitical. And that means that semiconductors have become a strategic priority for many, many countries. A lot of countries are trying to bring back some manufacturing or to reshore some key capabilities. So we've seen over the last few months, a lot of countries highlighting a lot of different plans. The US has a CHIPS Act, where it plans to spend as much as $52 billion US. The EU is going to have its own CHIPS Act in 2022, where it plans to spend around 40 billion euros. France has recently released its France in 2030 plan, where it's planning to spend 6 billion euros. And even more recently, Japan, in conjunction with TSMC and with Sony, is going to try to build a fab in Japan, specifically catering to the autos industry and spending around 8 or 9 billion US dollars. So we're seeing a lot of countries basically looking to reshore, seeing chip as a strategic priority, and trying to bring chip manufacturing closer to the final assembly, whether it's for the car industry or anybody else. And basically the key idea there is to try to rely less on Taiwan and on the Asian market for that chip manufacturing, and try to bring it back to some level to the US and to Europe.
Well, that's actually a perfect transition to my final question to you, because the elephant in the room here is China. I suppose China has big plans for semiconductors. How has it reacted to the current situation and also the tensions between China and Taiwan?
Yes, so in terms of China, it's been slightly less impacted by the chip shortage, but much more by US sanctions. We've seen with sanctions on Huawei or SMIC, which is a Chinese manufacturing company, because China remains a key manufacturing hub. So that's where semiconductors will be assembled into final products. It's a key strategic priority for China, and it's realized with the sanction how reliant it was on foreign players. So it's trying to become far more self-sufficient, and we've seen plans in the latest 5-year plan that the Chinese Communist Party has introduced. Right now, China is about 5 years behind compared to TSMC in terms of chip technology. And because the chip market is very fragmented on the value chain with a lot of different companies, very, very specialized, it's actually very difficult to become a leader in each of those different parts. So even though China will spend as much as it can, it will do as much as it can to catch up, it might be very difficult for it to do so. And at that point, it may make Taiwan even more crucial for the future of the Chinese economy if it can't get to that top level in 2030 or before and after.
Thanks so much, Dexter, and thanks so much, Andrew. We're coming to the end of our video now. You can always find our latest analysis, for instance, on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on global supply chains, or our forecasts for commodities prices, or our latest global economic outlooks on our website, www.eau.com. You can also find our latest analysis on Twitter @DEAU or on our personal Twitter. Thank you very much for joining us. See you next month. Stay safe. Goodbye.